live. Robert.
Good. Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar, which is going to be discussing data breaches. And first of all, can we say thank you very much from DPN and from the panel to all of the questions that you put to us in advance. We've got a great panel. We'll be introducing ourselves in a minute. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Robert Bond, and I'm moderating today, or chairing today, and I'm also chair of the board of DPN. And now I will hand over to Simon.
Okay, right. Hello, everybody. Hopefully the slides have now appeared on screen. So yeah, we're covering data breaches and talking about how we go about assessing the risk of a data breach. So just to give you a little introduction to who we are, first of all, for those who've not been to one of our webinars before or one of our events, Data Protection Network. So we have a consultancy business. We work with clients large and small across many different sectors. We also produce lots of free-to-air kind of articles on our website. If you'd like to visit and can download lots of articles that we produce there. And obviously we do a lot of events as well. Just like the one that we've got today. Also mention that we have our privacy question time coming up soon, which is on the 10th of November. So take a look at the events page if you want to find out any more. And obviously we do lots of training and other kinds of activities as well for our clients. So that's us. And I'll just bring up the panel here now. I may as well, I guess, Robert, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Okie dokie. Well, so it says on there, Today, I'm president of the Society for Corporate Compliance and Ethics. I've got about one more month and then I'm handing over to somebody else. So we'll have to update that slide. But apart from that, I'm a data protection lawyer. I've been doing data protection since 1983. And inevitably, a lot of what I do is helping clients manage data breaches, if not prevent them. So that's me.
Right. So I'm Simon Blanchard. So yeah, I work as a partner at Data Protection Network. Been there for quite a long time, and helping a range of different clients of large businesses, small businesses of all different kind of sectors, with all their kind of data protection matters, including data breaches. Or helping to prevent them, as you said, Robert. I've got some commercial and marketing experience behind me as well. Before I kind of went into the world of data protection, I previously held the role of head of data and online at Bauer Media, so a large publishing company. And I conduct. I'm a course tutor for the Institute of Data and Marketing on responsible marketing, as well as data protection as well. So that's me. So hand to Yasmin.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Yasmin Rahman, and I've been working in data protection for 11, 12 years now. I've been part of my role has been working in data protection teams in BMW and automotive, so followed by a UK charity. And my last role was also being the head DPO for a global events company. So I've done a bit of everything in lots of different sectors. I took a bit of break and now I've returned back into data protection as a consultant. I'm working for a multinational software and IT company, supporting their chief privacy officer, reevaluating their privacy governance and helping to improve that as well. So lots of different industry and sectors I've worked in. Prior to data protection, I definitely moved around as well. Audit background, IT governance, project management, security, risk. So, I regard myself a bit of a jack of all trades.
Hi, my name is Martin Turner. I run a company called Full Frame Technology, and we provide cybersecurity services to mainly the media sector, although we do work with other industry sectors as well. We specialize in the media because that's our background. I used to work for the BBC. I was a journalist, a bureau chief in Africa and in Washington, DC. And I spent a lot of my career at the BBC complaining about technology. And so eventually I was put in charge of it and told to sort it out, which I did for 6 years, and which I eventually decided was enough to end my career with the BBC. So I've been running Full Frame Technology since 2016. And we work with a range of organizations, both very big broadcasters in the UK and around the world, and also small production companies, including ones that are just starting out and ones that have grown. So we have quite a wide set of experience across dealing with the challenges that the media sector faces.
Good. Thank you all. And I get passed back to you again, Simon.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to take you through just a few slides to kind of set the scene more than anything for what we've got coming for you today. First one, really, again, from some of the scenarios that we had coming forward, we did have one or two that were provided by our audience weren't in fact a data breach. Were actually more of a violation of data protection laws rather than a data protection breach. So we thought it was worth just making sure that we're all clear. So what do we mean by the terms data incident, and when actually is there a data breach? So first of all, a data incident is some kind of security event that will compromise the integrity or confidentiality or availability of the data or information that you're holding as a business. But when it becomes a personal data breach is when it involves personal data, I guess, which is really particularly data that can directly identify an individual, or in fact data that can be linked in some way so that you can indirectly identify the individual. So some kind of unique reference number, for example, like a national insurance number or a payroll number or any other kind of identifier that we might have that might then be used to link back to an individual. So the way that we've got described under GDPR, the way that a data breach is described is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data that's transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. So it's a broad description, but we're talking here about accidental as well as we're talking about intentional kind of access and disclosure of data too. And just to give you some examples of the source of this is the ICO that produce a regular survey that shows the kind of data breaches that are reported to them. So it covers both what we call a non-cyber breach and what we call a cyber breach. So let me just give you some examples of each one. And you can see here that 70% of the total reported breaches to the ICO in the UK are actually non-cyber. So they generally, one of the scenarios that I think we're going to talk about will be kind of accidental disclosure by individuals of data. So a very large proportion, so 24%, as you can see, data emailed or posted to incorrect recipients, unauthorized kind of access to data where an individual's got access to data they shouldn't have access to, or loss or theft of paperwork or data that's left in a location that wasn't secure. So there's some of the more common ones. And of the cyber threats, things like social engineering, phishing scams, and also ransomware come out pretty high on the cyber list. And just a little reminder, really, around data breaches, they do come in all kinds of shapes and sizes, and no doubt we're going to talk about quite a few of them today. But it's a reminder, really, that as soon as you'll become aware of a breach, the clock is ticking immediately. The timeline that we actually have for reporting a breach to our supervisory authority is a very short one, actually. It's just 72 hours. And one of the first things we need to identify, of course, is there any personal data involved? But then once we've identified and we've worked through the breach, is that breach going to be reportable? Do we need to report it to our supervisory authority, such as the ICO in the UK? So again, that's what we'll be talking about today, is how we make that decision. So these are the things that we're going to talk about. We'll talk, I think, a bit about how we get well prepared, but also we're going to talk through 4 data breach scenarios that have kind of been provided by our audience. So we've selected some of the best ones from that, and there were some common themes that come out. So some are quite broad ranging because there were certain themes around accidental disclosure that came out time and time again. We'll talk then about how we can be well prepared, how we can go about establishing facts behind it, and understanding what kind of questions do we need to be asking of our teams, how we go about then identifying and assessing what the scale of those risks would be, and then deciding if we need to report it either to the supervisory authority or notify it to the data subjects. And that's it, Robert. I'll hand back to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Simon. So I often get asked, how do you get management's attention around this subject? And the answer is cause a data breach. It's quite surprising when with hindsight, you realize, I wish we'd thought of this, I wish we'd got that in place, etc. So before we get into the scenarios, I wanted to just ask the three of you, what would you recommend a business should be doing in advance of a breach? What's the prevention rather than the cure? And I'll start, Yasmin, with you. What do you think from your experience? What should we do in advance?
I think in advance, I mean, awareness has got to be there, training, and, you know, if you saw the list of the non-cyber, particularly incidents that were happening, some of them were just accidental errors by employees. And so I think training, awareness, making people a little bit vigilant about how they're handling data, personal data and confidential data, I think has to be really critical and up there. So that's my one on the prevention, at least.
Okay. And again, I've often said when I've been internal DPO in law firms to the staff, don't be ashamed to admit that you've had an issue, you've left a laptop on a train, or you've inadvertently sent something to somebody that shouldn't have received it. Be ashamed that you didn't tell the IT department, compliance, at the earliest opportunity. I find, again, sorry to use my hackneyed phrase, but you have to assume in your business you're surrounded by idiots. And you need to be thinking about almost the lowest common denominator. And I agree with you, Yasmin, train. But it's having the something to train upon, I think. I mean, you know, Simon, from your work and with the DPN, what were the sort of things, you know, that you've recommended should be done in advance?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm absolutely with you on this one, Yasmin. the training and awareness is absolutely the foundation and the fundamentals, making sure that you've got that clear. And equally a clear reporting path, because people are not always clear. So how do I go about reporting it? Do I talk to my manager? Do I report it to like an IT help desk? What's the best way of doing it so that it happens? So that can be a bit of a blocker in some organizations. So that's key. But the other bit, I think, is to prepare some kind of a playbook, would be the way I'd call it. Could be a policy in some organizations, but something that makes sure that you've thought through the process of how it's going to work. So we'd encourage organizations to think about developing a playbook. And what I mean by that is in addition to covering the training and awareness activity that you're going to put in place, but also how you're going to go about appointing some kind of response team. Having an immediate first responder is the important thing. Who are going to be the key people that you're going to contact as soon as you become aware? How you go about establishing the facts, you know, working out whether personal data is involved or if it's not. You know, how sensitive is the data, what volume, those kind of things, those questions, and the key triage process that you're going to put in place to be able to deal with it first is kind of absolutely fundamental before you kind of take it any further. So knowing how you're going to respond, because appreciating that your organization is really going to be under pressure for time when this happens, you're going to want to know everything at once. So having a plan and having a procedure that those key people are trained in, I think is essential.
Okay, good. And having a desktop exercise as well to actually make sure the plan really works.
I agree.
Yep.
Martin, I guess you got thoughts on that too.
Martin, what do you think from your experience?
Well, I can. Yep, absolutely. You know, it's the basics. It's assuming, unfortunately, that the likelihood is that an organization will experience a data breach at some point. And therefore preparing on that basis and having a plan in place and one that is tested with a tabletop exercise with scenarios that are realistic, that get the buy-in of senior management. I mean, that is absolutely crucial. And as part of that, you have to look at logging and retention. So in other words, you know, what does an organization have? What data does it have? Where is it? Who has access to it? because those exercises will throw up the issues about how information is passed on in a situation where normal systems might not be available. Going back to what Robert was saying, I would respectfully disagree slightly on the idea that that everybody is an idiot, which is another version of the the user is the weakest link. I mean, there is absolutely a valid way to look at it that takes that perspective. Personally, we tend to view the user as potentially the strongest link. One of the crucial things we believe is translating the need to protect information from being something that just affects you at work to something that affects you in your life as a whole. So when we don't actually call training, because you train dogs, you don't train people in information security. You make it real by telling stories and actually connecting it to people's everyday life, to how family and friends use technology securely. And so in our training, we put 20 pounds on a chair, whether virtually or in real life, and challenge people to fine us if we start talking technological gobbledygook. In other words, terms that the people attending the awareness sessions don't understand. And we use videos that are irreverent, to say the least. But the whole point of it is to tell stories and create that connection so that people go away talking about these issues and connecting them to their real lives, to their lives outside work, because that, we think, is the key. The worst thing is that data protection, information security as a whole, gets put in a box, it's put in the corner of the room, and then it's let out when something goes horribly wrong. It needs to be part of the everyday conversation, because in the end, that's the key that we believe to ensuring that if a breach happens, then it's going to cause as little damage as possible, and the response to it can be as effective as possible.
Okay, good. And just going back to you, Simon, have you, when you talk about having the playbook, and that, I think you called it the response team, can you give me some examples of who you think typically should be on that team internally to the business and who you might have on the team external?
Sure, yeah. I think to be honest, it will vary quite a bit depending on the type of business. But I'd expect people from obviously the information security side, legal team, but obviously they'll be working out which area of the business the breach has been. So if it involves staff data, for example, I'd want the head of staff, head of HR to be on there. So having the right functional heads as well involved who understand how that data is being used, the different systems it's on. So I think we've covered IT and security, we've covered legal roles, as well obviously compliance too, if you have a separate compliance and legal team, if you're fortunate to have both, your business heads. Who have we missed here? I think those are probably the key ones, and I think just depending on the kind of organisation that you have, some of those roles might well be external. I think it partly depends, on the size or the nature of the business, exactly how those are structured, because we find that varies quite a lot actually across clients and business that we work with, how much of those kind of functions are in-house, and how, depending on the size of the business, they might not have the levels of resources in-house and have to call on external experts to do those for them.
And I'm just going to go back to Martin here, because I'm probably going to say something you'll disagree with again. But my experience occasionally has been that you also need to think who's going to be excluded. There's some good examples of the chairman of the company being the person that should not be involved and talking to the press, etc., because they just make things worse. Do you find that as well, Martin, that you need to tightly control the PR side as well?
You do, yes, of course you do. But that is absolutely part of that. The preparation, that testing of how to communicate, who should communicate. That's what those exercises should enable an organization to get right, because the worst possible thing, and I'm sure many people attending this webinar, and I'm sure you have seen it as well, you know, if you try to work this out when you've got an incident in process, then it cannot possibly work. So testing that, ensuring that you have the right people, the right roles assigned to the right people, that really is absolutely crucial. So no, I completely agree with you. Often the chairman will not be that right person.
So I'm going to ask a slightly different question to Yasmin before we move on. So let's assume that you've been told there is an incident. How do you assess whether that incident is a reportable incident? Is it a breach but it's not reportable? How do you juggle those issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it can be extremely challenging. So one of the things that I certainly do in my previous roles is understand which regulators you'll need to potentially report to. So again, it goes back to understanding your data, understanding what data you've collected as your organization. And so understanding what is the ICO's position on data breaches and their interpretation of what is an incident versus a reportable breach, and what they would expect you to be doing in terms of assessing harm and risk and so forth. But that can vary quite significantly if it's a breach out of the US. So again, having familiarity with your organization and those data breach laws out of the US or any other jurisdiction, I think is worthwhile doing. And again, it's part of your preparedness as far as I'm concerned, understanding those differences as well.
And let's not forget that for many organizations, the breach will require notification to other regulators. So if you're in insurance, you've got to consider reporting to Lloyd's. You know, if you're in the health sector, you'll have, you know, it may be a medical regulatory issue. So we mustn't forget that it's not just about the data protection authorities. But again, Simon, what do you think? How do you measure the severity, the reportableness? Sorry for the grammar.
Yeah, sorry, was that for me, Robert?
Yes, to you, Simon.
Yeah. I think, as you say, the nuts and bolts of this can become quite challenging, yeah, as Yasmin said. But I think the things I'd be looking to understand will be, you know, so assuming that we've identified, because the first job is to identify, is personal data involved normally, and that sometimes can take a while to be sure on that. But then once you've identified that personal data is involved, I'd want to understand, so what is the nature of that data? As in, you know, what kind of data is it? So what sensitivity does it have will be a key question. You know, what kind of potential consequences could you have from that data being, you know, in the wrong hands? So I'd be looking at the nature, the sensitivity, but also the volume of the records affected. And sometimes you don't know that immediately. So quite a bit of kind of triage and diagnostic work is to work out. So how many records do we think have been, you know, potentially been affected? And again, depending on whether that's something that's happened internally, where you're the controller, or whether you're beholden on others to provide that information. If you had a processor, for example, who suffered the breach, and therefore you're trying to get information from a third party from this, or a system provider, etc., they can be quite difficult to get those answers quickly. But that's what you're trying to get your handle on, I think, is the nature, the sensitivity, and the volume. And particularly then that gives you a view on you know, whose hands it's in as well. What do you know about, you know, have you got a bad actor involved, or is it an accidental disclosure? And therefore that will hopefully lead you to understand what those potential consequences might look like. And that for me would be, you know, the key things that I'd want to know to be able to work out whether I thought it was going to be a reportable breach.
Okay, super. Now, before we look at the scenarios, I've got some questions that have been coming in. One is, Is a data security incident cyber only? Martin, what do you think?
No, absolutely not. I think often there's the idea of cybersecurity and information security are terms that are used interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. So information security is the entirety of the confidentiality and integrity and availability of information. Cyber is one element in how that's protected. So the short answer is no. And I think if one does focus narrowly on cybersecurity, then something's going wrong.
Okay. So let's take the first scenario, and I'm going to start with Simon on this one, because you were sort of touching on this in your last comments. So several people said, let's say we've had an accidental operator error disclosure where everything has gone out with people in the 2 box rather than in the BCC box. We're not sure at this stage whether it's sensitive or not, but what would you be doing the moment you've discovered this, and in the next few hours, the next day, etc., given that in the worst case you've got a 72-hour window? What would you do, Simon?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is probably the most common type of data breach, as I think the stats showed. So I'd want to be able to understand, the nature of that kind of data. Who were the people that it was sent to? Who were the people that were copied? And so what information has got out around them? Is it just their email address, or is there any other data that would be revealed in that? And therefore, as we said, how sensitive is that? So an example, a case study was the one with HIV Scotland. If you might recall, there was a data breach with HIV Scotland that shared some data with that. Therefore, that they did exactly the same. In fact, the data that they should have sent using the BCC method to blind copy everyone, they put into the CC column. So that, of course, was much more sensitive data, and that comes to bear about whether you report it then in that case. So that's one of the key things you want to understand. And as I said, then looking at the volume that's affected. And from understanding, I think when you've got an understanding of the nature, the sensitivity, and the volume, you can then decide. You can go a long way to deciding as to whether that report, whether that's reportable then.
And so
quite often they're fairly innocuous. I'll be honest. Yep. They might well be that. We often get the scenario where something has been copied to 2 or 3 people, which generally. I have to say generally here, because there are always exceptions to this. Generally, is fairly innocuous. Would not be the kind of thing that you would look to report. But of course, depending on the sensitivity of that, even one person, if it's particularly sensitive information in that, then it could be reportable. But you have to make a judgment call when you understand that, I think.
Yeah, and do you want to add anything to that, Yasmin?
No, I totally agree with Simon. You have to assess the situation and take measures that are appropriate. I would say often it's a little bit about communication at that point, because individuals who have been included by accident might get a bit upset. So you might want to make sure that you're communicating back that it was accidental disclosure. Ask people to delete the email if they've received them, that sort of thing. So, I would not necessarily think about it being reportable, but there are some things that you want to take care of.
We have so many examples of when this type of operator error occurs, where you send the right attachment to the wrong email address because of autofill. Martin, from a technical point of view, are there things that we could be doing to actually give us breathing space before send is hit?
There are, yes. Most email systems do provide a certain number of technical controls that both remind individuals about who they're sending emails to, or externally, which provides an opportunity to recall an email in case you've done something horribly bad or even trivially bad, and which provide those sort of tracking capabilities that allow you to make sure you know what's happening. So yes, there are things, and as others have said, and actually as one of the comments I see points out, you know, these are not necessarily always major issues. In fact, in many cases, in a case of one of our clients recently who emailed their entire supplier distribution list by copying rather than blind copying. You know, it's not a major incident, but it is a bit embarrassing, particularly when the suppliers start replying to all as opposed to replying to the individual sender. But I think it does go back to this idea of education and including the making use of the capabilities that whatever email platform you have that you're using, what is available.
Okay, and I see plenty of good comments coming in as we've been talking, and yeah, not yet, in my view, not every incident is reportable. Every incident should be logged and learnt from, I believe, but again, I've often found that much like Martin gets called in from a technical side, I'm often called in for legal privilege purposes as excellent counsel to sit down and do some analysis over, do we report, don't we report? And the ICO's been the first to say for a number of years, please don't over-report. Yeah. We would rather that you really consider the seriousness or otherwise of this. If you don't have to report to us, we'd still expect you to be learning from this and putting in checks and balances to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And I also think the other thing I found with businesses, that the risk of over-reporting, or at least when you report, you've put your head above the parapet. And the ICO is almost bound to be giving you a case reference and asking questions. So if you're going to report, I want to make sure you've got all of your other proverbial ducks in a row so that you can respond pretty quickly. One of the other questions that we had was, how do you manage the situation where the breach is not you as the controller, but has happened in the hands of your processor or sub-processor? What should we be doing to manage what happens next with the processor and sub-processor? I'm going to turn to Yasmin for this one.
So this can be absolutely challenging, I agree. So do you mean, Robert, just so I'm clarified, we believe that the processor who has been maybe hosting or running our IT system or platform, they've had a data breach sometime?
Yeah, but of our data, possibly.
Well, I hope we've got a good data protection agreement that says we can ask them whatever questions we need to ask them. And so that should have been done way before the vendor, your vendor due diligence and onboarding processes. So we should absolutely be going back to them to ask them what has happened, what have they done to contain the situation and remediate the situation. I think in this case as well, the processor may be thinking of reporting. Sometimes they do. So again, you want a really clear line of communication with them, because if they are thinking about doing it, particularly if they have a platform that they're running on behalf of many other customers, then I think you will need to think about that they may be thinking about choosing to report on behalf of the many customers, or other customers may be thinking about their own reporting requirements. So there's a lot to play with in that area about what it is that, how are you going to respond, and what are you going to do as well. So I think it's a lot more challenging when it's a processor involved, but I think you've got to have good and clear communication with what is it the processor is up to and what are other customers doing as well.
Yeah, I mean, just in the middle of something at the moment where even with the best contract in the world, the processor went off and notified several regulators of something where they hadn't even at that stage identified that any personal data was involved at all. They'd had a ransomware attack. And then suddenly all of those customers, the controllers, are now having to work out how do we manage this when we can't actually tell the ICO whether anything's been exfiltrated or not. It's with hindsight, again, you think, wow, I wish we'd had a better control of this scenario. Have you got other examples like that, Simon?
Yeah, I've seen that happen before as well, actually, where I've heard directly from a processor, and I've had clients that have had the same, where they've heard from a processor, we know we've had a data breach, but we can't tell you at the moment. We can't reveal the facts either because they choose not to, which doesn't happen so often, but usually because we don't yet know. We haven't identified whether personal data is involved. We can't tell you the volume. We can't tell you, and can't really tell you anything. And that, unfortunately, for controllers, will create a real problem. And also bearing in mind, I think it's worth us mentioning here that we've got the whole supply chain to consider, not just the processor, but the sub-processor and their sub-processor. So these can be quite long chains where, again, even with the best contract in the world that makes it very clear that we can ask these questions, we're quite reliant on the goodwill and the speed of activity and them being able to handle their breach as well, of a sub-processor then reporting it up to a processor who reports it up to their, who reports it up the line. And there can quite often be a long chain of command involved to be able to get the information if you're a controller. So asking the right questions, I think, is key. But sometimes, sadly, we are quite beholden on the suppliers further down the chain to provide that information to us, so that we can make the right call, which is it's not easy.
Yeah. And the other thing, just sort of, while I'm thinking about it, is whenever there's the incident and you're taking a look at it, don't forget that actually there may be no personal data, but actually your biggest risk of as a business is that what's been attacked or been lost is business trade secrets, confidential information, data that you are holding for third parties, where it's a breach of contract as to what has happened next. And there may be intellectual property risks, all sorts of things, which aren't necessarily your problem as the data protection person, but they are the business's problem. I don't know, do you find this, Martin, that often it's not just about the personal data, it's about data, period?
Yes, I mean, this applies very strongly to the media sector, where one of the key threats that organizations face is the loss or theft of program of content. And in some cases, this has been deliberate, where North Korea, as I'm sure many people will remember, deliberately set out to sabotage Sony, for example, and closer to the UK home, they intervened to prevent a Channel 4 drama being made. So very much in the case of the media sector, but looking at recent incidents, in Uber's case, and from a brand reputation perspective, as it is from personal data.
Okay, and I can see a number of delegates are saying, I would always report the breach, even if I don't know the full scale of it. It's interesting, in the past, at the annual ICO conference some years ago, one of the investigation officers said, we would prefer that you do tell us when there's an incident, rather than us discovering it from social media or in the newspapers, because that doesn't help us when we're getting the press asking us about something we don't know about either. So yes, there are some very good issues as to why you should report as early as possible. But, you know, you are still putting your head above the parapet, and you may well get asked questions, particularly if it's a processor, sub-processor, supply chain area, as Simon was saying, where they'll want to see the contract. They'll want to know. And indeed, that's exactly what the ICO has asked my client with the breach that was in the hands of the processor. They're saying, we want to see what your contract was like. And they may well ask some other things, even though we still don't know anything about the volume of our data that's been lost. So again, do be prepared for what happens next. And I guess we've also got to think about, where is that processor, sub-processor? Will there be any issues now about international data transfers? Why are you using a processor / sub-processor in that jurisdiction? Have you assessed risk? All of those sorts of things will be questions that come out. So be prepared for those. Let's just have a look at the other scenario, which is cyber breaches. A lot of people asked about how do we manage the issues of whether it's social engineering, whether it's phishing, malware, ransomware. Are they really different? I mean, Martin, from your point of view, are cyber breaches just one big lump of third-party attacks, or is it more subtle than that?
It's very difficult, I think, to make blanket statements about this, other than to say that at the moment the statistics are frankly gruesome. I mean, you know, there are as many statistics as, you know, you produce a weekly newsletter, for example, and sifting what is a decent statistic out from what's basically just a sales pitch is one of the key things that we do. But there's no question that there are really dramatic increases in the amount of phishing attempts, and phishing covers such a broad range of activities, from email lures to voicemails to social media messages and so on. But looked at in their entirety, there's a huge increase in the number of these, and I think it goes back to this idea of trying to help people to recognize the potential impact of these things on their lives, both at work and at home, because the reality is that, you know, anyone with even a modicum of sort of technological understanding is now able to set themselves up as a cyber criminal, if you forgive that phrase. And you know, the kits that are available, the information that's available to be bought, all of these things make it essential that people understand what the risk is, and therefore why reusing passwords, why putting information on social media that really shouldn't be there is so risky, both at work and at home. And our experience is that when people have this explained in terms that make sense, and with stories and examples that resonate, then they go away and they talk about this stuff, and they will adopt a password manager, for example. They will talk about it with their friends and colleagues. And that's what creates a foundation that helps to prevent these types of incidents. I'd be the first to admit that you can't eliminate them, but you can definitely mitigate or reduce the likelihood, and thereby help people personally as well as in their working environment. So not one amorphous mass. It needs specific examples of specific types of cyber attacks. But if you raise the awareness of what's going on and what the risk is, then people's ability to manage their security and their organization's security really is raised in our experience.
Okay. What do you think, Yasmin? Do you think it's right or ethical to pay the ransom? You're on mute.
I think you're on mute. Yeah, Yasmin.
Oh, apologies. Sorry, I didn't realise. Back on. I was going to say, Robert, that's a really tough question. Really tough one. And I was lucky enough to, in my last company, we did a ransomware simulation as a tabletop exercise. And we hotly debated the question about whether we would pay or not pay. And again, I would probably say, as others have said on this call, think it through in advance, because when you're actually in the hot seat, if you're subject to an actual incident, thinking will be quite difficult. So at least have these discussions beforehand. What data could be held to ransom? What could the consequences be on the company? Is this something that you would want to do or not do? And who would need to be involved in that discussion? So I think it is a very challenging situation when you're being held to ransom, because obviously you want the company back up and running, and you're being held over a barrel at that point usually. Yep.
And indeed there might be, and I'm aware of one situation where the ransom was paid to enable the company to understand what had actually been taken.
Yep.
You know, okay, I'm conscious of time, and there's one topic that I'd like us to have touched on, and that's, what do we do about the data subjects? So we know that the law requires notification where, you know, to the regulator within 72 hours if it is likely to have a significant impact. And then we see the bits that say, and then you need to notify data subjects as soon as possible. But again, is there how do you do it? When do you do it? Are there occasions where there is no need to tell the data subjects? What do you think, Simon?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, to be honest, there are probably not as many situations where you do need to notify individuals as organisations might instinctively think that there are. I found lots of instances, in fact, particularly even where they're reportable to the ICO, where you don't necessarily need to notify the individuals. But I think the important thing is you do need a process to properly assess this. Again, just the same as we've talked about before, you need to be very clear on what is likely to be the impact on the individual. In fact, what potentially could go wrong, what the consequences could look like, and therefore, is there a key reason why you need to notify those individuals? And this will come down to the potential for harm, really, I think. And that's where how the ICO is going to look at this as well, is to be able to work out, whether there is a high risk to the individuals of some harm taking place, and how serious could those consequences be. So that's kind of that. So the threshold maybe is a little higher from that point of view than it would be for reporting to the ICO or reporting to another supervisory authority. But we need to make sure that we've got a clear method of working that out. And again, using things like sensitivity and volume and the nature would be a good way that you could benchmark it and score it, so that you would then decide, okay, what do those harms look like? Do we need to notify people or not?
And do you think...
Consider the consequences, of course, of notifying them. What impact could that have? Your call center, for example, could be inundated. How are you going to be able to respond to it? Have we got enough information to be able to respond well? Do we need to, put in place some dark web reporting for individuals? That it gives you actually, when you're getting into the situation of notifying individuals, there's quite a lot of other considerations that you need to also put into the mix around how your organisation is going to deal with the potential consequences of you notifying those individuals. I'm not saying you don't do it, because there's very good reasons to do it in many cases, but you need to be very well prepared before you do that.
And I'm sure I've heard in the past the ICO saying there might be an occasion where you could cause more distress to the individual, notifying something that was an issue but was for such a small period of time that the risk was low, and now you've just exacerbated by saying too much. Or do you think that's not right? I don't know. What do you think, Yasmin? Sorry, I'm coming to you with all the bad questions, aren't I?
I think that, again, is the ethical dilemma, isn't it? I mean, I think in all of these scenarios, as a DPO or a data protection expert, you've got to be the one representing the individuals impacted. So in all of the dialogue, in all the meetings, in all the conversation, that's got to be a critical aspect that you must be evaluating all the way along. And I think you really do have to think about what is the consequence on the individual, and if they're notified, what do we do to reassure them as far as you can that you've done everything, and any sort of consequences are limited after that. Yeah, I'm probably more on the side of if I do think there are consequences on the individual, then they should be notified. Yes. Mm-hmm. But how you go about doing that, and in what manner, and what additional measures you put in place, I think that's really got to be thought through as well, because often it could be a very large group of individuals, or even if it's just one person, to be honest. I think you need to take these things into account.
And of course, depending on the business, it may be individuals who are in vulnerable categories, or it may be children, where there's all sorts of other issues. That's what you've got to think about there. Yeah. And then when we look at some of the bigger, well-publicized breaches, whilst you're doing all the right thing, you're notifying the ICO, you're notifying the individuals, you're then going to find you get the loss of control claims, and you get the quasi-class actions. That's certainly what we're seeing a lot more happening out there. Do you see that, Martin?
Yeah, I think generally there is a greater level of awareness amongst the general public that they do have a mechanism to pursue organizations that lose their data. And in some, I mean, that is a good thing. When you see the really, really huge breaches, like Equifax, going back a while, and Optus, just over the past few days, I mean, a really vast breach that will change Australian law. I have enormous sympathy with people having that recourse, but I think for organizations, the challenge of dealing with situations as they develop, it has become really, really difficult. And I don't think there are easy answers. I think, unfortunately, and I'm sure everybody on this webinar would agree, it comes back to making sure that the basics are right, that preparation has been done, that the plans are tested. That's hardly groundbreaking to say, but in our experience, the real issue is that there may be good plans, but they're often not tested as well as they might be. And really focusing on that and getting buy-in from senior management to test plans is crucial when there are so many, particularly at the moment, so many challenges that organizations are facing. But these are just not optional extras. These are fundamental to the running of an organization, and ensuring that they do have that profile and that the required level of buy-in. In our experience, that is really the key.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. absolutely agree with you. I'm going to suggest that each of us give some last thoughts. I've been looking at a lot of the really good chat that's coming in, and people are coming at this from different directions. There's quite a lot of people saying, it's reputation is a big issue, and I think we've all said that from time to time. We don't always have to notify data subjects is another comment that's quite rightly come in. Generally, what you do, I think, is also driven by the type of business you're in, the sector, and also the company's risk appetite. There will still be organizations out there that will say, our strategy is to have no strategy. You'll still find that people won't address this, but do you have any sort of final thoughts? I'm going to start again with Yasmin before we come towards the end. So final thoughts on the entire topic, Yasmin.
So final thoughts. I think a couple of key things, as I said right at the beginning, awareness, make sure people understand how to recognize a breach and what to do. That's got to be a critical part of your approach, and something that you encourage. And don't make it difficult for people to report a breach. Make it easy, straightforward, and off they go. So I think that's definitely one aspect. The second aspect, know your organization. What are the breaches, potential incidents that could happen? Because that's going to be different in different sectors, and how you react and what you'll need to do and what questions you'll need to ask. So really think about not just taking off the shelf some breach run book, actually tailor it for your company. And I think the last key point I'd leave is test it. Have some discussions, testing. You might not be able to pay for a company to do a big ransomware tabletop exercise with you, but just run some scenarios and run some meetings and think these through and discuss them with key other teams and stakeholders. That can just be part of your testing approach, and it will, kick the tires on whatever it is that you've developed and give you a lot of interesting feedback and how to improve it as well. So those are probably three key things I'll probably leave with.
Lovely, thank you. And Martin, the same for you, please.
I won't repeat what I just said because I know time is short. But knowing what you've got, knowing where it is, knowing who's got access to it, and then making sure that the processes and response plans are tested, absolutely crucial. I completely agree with Yasmin. You don't need to pay people to help you do that. One thing I would just highlight, I'm sure many people are aware of this, but this idea of defeating multi-factor authentication, I think, is a real worry at the moment. Really crucial that people are aware of just how much this is being done and how sophisticated the mechanisms that are being used to achieve it are. So I really would accentuate this in any awareness sessions that are taking place, because it is a real danger at the moment.
Thank you, Martin. And then finally, I'll leave it to you, Simon, to your final thoughts, and then I'll also leave you, Simon, to just close things down as well. Great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so great. Thanks to the panel. Thanks Robert, Yasmin, and Martin. I won't. You've already covered, a lot of the key areas that I would have mentioned. So I'm just thinking of the extra little bits that I just want to just dip in that we haven't covered today. Maybe the one thing I think we did briefly touch on, making sure that you do a post-breach review. I totally say that's vital. Learn the lessons, even from the smaller breaches. The other thing I just wanted to touch on was data retention. If you're holding data for too long, you're doubling your risk there. You might be found that you are holding that the data that was breached, you should no longer have lawfully held that data. So I think data breach is another good reason for tackling data retention across organizations. So that's just one other thing I wanted to add. And then finally, just to mention that if you do want to hear more about this topic, there's obviously been a lot of interest in this area. And thanks again to our audience for the scenarios you put forward and for all of the all of the comments that we've had in the chat log here. So thank you for that. Just to mention that our data breach guidance is also available on the DPN website. If you want to find out more, something that we published a year or so ago, please take a look on the website for our data breach guide if you'd like to find out any more. Thanks again to the panel. Thanks again to you as an audience, and